The island of New Guinea was the worst place in the world to fight a war. General Douglas MacArthur's chief engineering officer called it the ultimate nightmare country and said that U.S. forces fighting on the island of New Guinea would face challenges without precedent in American military history. And this, mind you, was after the tragedy of the Bataan Peninsula, which had already set the bar for suffering very high. Unfortunately, General MacArthur did not heed his chief engineering officer's advice. It was a decision that he would come to regret. My book, The Ghost Mountain Boys, Their Epic March and the Terrifying Battle for New Guinea, The Forgotten War of the South Pacific, chronicles the ferocity of the fighting in the early battles of 1942 on the island of New Guinea at the villages of Buna and Sanananda, and the suffering and heroism of the 32nd Red Arrow Infantry Division. What I've tried to do with this book is write less of a military history than what I hope is a deeply personal soldier story. And to do that, I interviewed over 60 veterans of the campaign. And throughout the book, I've interspersed their anecdotes, their journal entries, and their letters. In fact, I begin the book with the letters of Major Simon Warmenhoven, the division surgeon, to his wife, their love letters, and they're very poignant love letters. And I felt that they expressed and captured the heartache and the longing that all of the soldiers fighting on the island of New Guinea must have felt. Prior to World War II, the 32nd Red Arrow Infantry Division was made up largely of National Guardsmen from the farms and small towns of the Midwest. In October 1940, when the National Guard was federalized, they were loaded onto trains and sent to the Deep South to begin their training. One of the first places they went to was a place called Camp Beauregard in Louisiana, which, with characteristic soldiers' humor, they called Camp Disregard. And there they did a lot of marching with broom handles for rifles. In 1941, they were sent to another camp in Louisiana called Camp Livingston. And shortly after, they participated in something called the Louisiana Maneuvers, which were the largest peacetime war games in U.S. history. There, they trained in modern, mechanized, mobile warfare, the kind of warfare that was being fought on the European front, and the kind of warfare that they would not need on the island of New Guinea. In fact, the training they received in Louisiana was completely irrelevant to their experience in New Guinea. One of the main characters of my book is a man named Major Herbert Stutterin Smith from Neillsville, Wisconsin. And Major Smith wrote in his journal, "The swamps of Louisiana were so available, but we did not train in them, had we only known." The fact of the matter is, they didn't know. After they thought they'd be going to the European front, and after the Louisiana maneuvers, they were sent by train to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, which they thought would be their last stopover before being sent to Europe. In fact, their engineering unit had already been sent to Northern Ireland, and they thought that they would be following them in a short amount of time. But instead of being sent to Europe, they were again loaded onto trains, sent clear across the United States to San Francisco, California, and after a few weeks they were loaded onto troop ships and sent out to sea. None of them had any notion where they were going, but the scuttlebutt aboard the ships was that they'd end up in Alaska or Fiji or India. Where they ultimately landed was Adelaide, Australia. They were supposed to be going to Brisbane, Australia, but the battle for the Coral Sea was in progress, so they were rerouted to Adelaide. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Adelaide, Australia, but it is not the place where soldiers go to begin their jungle training. The soldiers trained in Adelaide, Australia, and then in mid-July 1942, General MacArthur learned that the Japanese Imperial Army had landed at Buna on the north coast of the Papuan Peninsula. When MacArthur got that news, he was beside himself. Just weeks before, he had unveiled a plan called Operation Providence, in which he was going to send his troops by ship around the Papuan Peninsula and seize the land that the Japanese had just captured. In order to understand exactly what I'm talking about, you need to understand the geography of New Guinea. New Guinea is the second largest island in the world, and it sits atop Australia like a giant prehistoric bird or a giant prehistoric dragon. And the dragon or bird's tail, the long dragon or bird's tail, is called the Papua Peninsula, and that hangs down to the southeast just above Australia. On the south coast of the Papuan Peninsula sits Port Moresby, which was the Allied base, and it had a very, very deep harbor. 150 miles northeast of Port Moresby lies Buna. Though General MacArthur was exceedingly alarmed by the news of the Japanese having landed there, he and his intelligence team felt that the Japanese would never attempt an overland invasion of Port Moresby on the south coast of the Papuan Peninsula. They believed that the Japanese Imperial Army, its only intention was to move inland 10 or 20 miles, build usable airfields, and that was the extent of it. They never believed that the Japanese Imperial Army was mad enough to attempt an overland invasion of Port Moresby, but that's exactly what the Japanese intended to do, and exactly what they did do via a rugged pre-World War II mail route through the mountains called the Kokoda Track. MacArthur was alarmed enough, though, by the Japanese invasion that he immediately mobilized the 32nd Division, which was still down in Adelaide, Australia. So they were loaded onto trains on narrow gauge tracks and sent north to Brisbane to a place called Camp Tambourine. But it was hardly a camp. They had thought they'd get there and they'd begin their jungle training, their river crossings and night exercises, and plotting compass courses through forests, but they literally had to build this camp from scratch. So when they should have been doing their jungle training, they were digging latrines and they were setting up tents. 2 months later, on the morning of September 15th, 1942, Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's chief intelligence officer, learned that the Japanese were standing just short of the Allied base of Port Moresby atop a ridge called Yora Bayer Ridge. And when General MacArthur got that news, he immediately mobilized the 32nd Division again and began sending them via transport planes to Port Moresby. The men of the 32nd Division were considered the guinea pigs of the South Pacific, and with good reason. They were untrained and they were ill-equipped for jungle warfare. They were sent to one of the hottest, wettest, most malarial places in the world without adequate jungle training, with heavy World War I gear, and with very little quinine. One of the first companies to land on the island of New Guinea in Port Moresby was Company E out of Big Rapids, Michigan. One of the characters in my book, Sergeant Paul Luchins of the 2nd Battalion, Company E, wrote in his diary, September 15th, 1942, 5:30 p.m., temperature 115 degrees. New Guinea weather is hotter than the lower story of hell. While Company E and Sergeant Paul Lutyens built a road south along the coast of the Papuan Peninsula, along with the 96 engineers, which, by the way, was an African-American engineering unit that was building throughout the course of the war roads and wharfs and airfields and harbors all across New Guinea, General MacArthur hatched a plan to send the 126th Infantry Regiment of the 32nd Division by land over the Papuan Peninsula to attack Buna, while Australian forces attempted to hold off the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby. In mid-September, he sent a man, Captain Jim Boyce of Swayze, Indiana, to scout a trail over the Papuan Peninsula and the rugged mountains of the Papuan Peninsula. 17 days in, Jim Boyce reached a place called Jaure, a small village called Jaure on the north coast on the north side of the Owen Stanley Mountains, and he radioed back to headquarters that the trail was taxing but practicable. That set in motion MacArthur's plan, and when General MacArthur shared this plan with the Australian generals, his plan to send over thousands of troops of men on a narrow jungle trail that was no more than a hunting and trading trail, and they told him that he was crazy. And they knew exactly what they were talking about, because New Guinea, or Papua New Guinea, the eastern half of the island, had been an Australian colony since the early 1900s. So they warned General MacArthur that the mountains were too high, the rivers were too fast, and the terrain was too rugged. 140 miles of fetid swamps and vast jungles, and mountains that in some cases are unmapped even today. They told him he would be sending his men to death, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. The next group to go after Jim Boyce had reconnoitered the trail was a group of 200 men led by Captain Alfred Miedendorp of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they were called the Miedendorp or Wairopi Patrol. And their job was to set up drop sites at 3-mile intervals along the trail. 10 days in, Captain Alfred Miedendorp wrote in his journal that New Guinea was nature gone mad. In early October 1942, 3 weeks after Jim Boyce had reconnoitered the trail, General MacArthur mobilized the 2nd Battalion of the 126th Infantry Regiment. 800 men began their march 2 weeks into the rainy season from a village on the south coast of the Papuan Peninsula called Gaba Gaba, which the soldiers mispronounced as Kappa Kappa. I'd like to make just a point of comparison right now, just so you all can understand exactly what the men were walking into. We consider Seattle or perhaps New Orleans to be the wettest cities in the United States, and they get between 40 and 70 inches of rain a year. Papua New Guinea's Papuan Peninsula gets between 200 and 300 inches of rain a year, and the bulk of that rain falls during the rainy season. So you can imagine what 800 pair of boots did to a muddy jungle trail. The men were walking in mud up to their ankles and soon up to their shins, and it was absolutely exhausting for them. And mind you, these were young men, 18, 19, 20-year-olds or in their early 20s who had been hardened by the Depression. So they were no strangers to hardship or suffering. Yet they were absolutely exhausted. About 10 days into their march, the suffering got worse when malaria hit. They'd been exposed to malaria on the south coast of the Papuan Peninsula, and now the parasites were reproducing inside their livers and bursting into their bloodstreams. So when the men were trekking, they were trekking with 102 and 103 degree fevers, and they were so weak and so dehydrated and so exhausted that they started to chuck things from their field packs. They threw out extra socks and underwear. They even threw out shelter halves and their sweaters. Little did they know that when they got to the high peaks of the Owen Stanleys, they'd be walking into swirling clouds of ice and rain, and they'd nearly freeze to death. About 10 days later, dysentery hit, and that's when the misery really began. Men collapsed from exhaustion and from dehydration, and they lay beside the trails begging their buddies not to pick them up, but to let them lie there and die. I'm going to read a journal entry from Sergeant Paul Luchins again, and it begins like this. You can hardly realize how wild and ghost-like this mountain country is. Almost perpetual rain and steam. We have been traveling over an almost impassable trail. Our strength is gone. Most of us have dysentery. Boys are falling out and dropping back with fever, continuous downpour of rain. We seem to climb straight up for hours, then down again. God, will it never end? The battalion, I should mention, was helped by 300 native New Guinean porters who carried heavy supply loads and in some cases piggybacked these soldiers who were lying beside the trail. I should also mention that the Papua New Guineans have never been officially thanked for their contribution to the war effort, yet they were absolutely essential to the 32nd Division. They served as carriers, as forward scouts, and once the battle began, as stretcher bearers. After 42 days, the men of the 32nd Division, who would come to be known as the Ghost Mountain Boys, made it to the north coast, and their grueling trek across the mountains ended. However, many of the men were physically shattered by the experience. Some had lost a third of their body weight, and perhaps most painful of all, they learned that their suffering had been in vain. MacArthur had decided, while they were marching across the mountains, General MacArthur's staff had discovered usable airfields on the north coast of the Papuan Peninsula, and the rest of the 32nd Division was flown over the mountains that undid the Ghost Mountain Boys. Despite the condition of these men, MacArthur sent the Ghost Mountain Boys directly into battle, and it was a battle that favored the Japanese Imperial Army in every way. Remember again that the Japanese Imperial Army had landed at Buna in mid-July, and they had time to construct bunkers up and down an 11-mile front, and they had time to reinforce these bunkers, and these bunkers were also interconnected. And the men of the 32nd Division had nothing to take these bunkers out. They had no tanks. They had no bazookas. They had no 105 millimeter howitzers. They had no destroyers off the coast shelling the positions of the Japanese. So they resorted to what they called Civil War tactics. They stormed the Japanese position, and in the words of one military historian, the fight at Buna was a knife fight out of the Stone Age. The Japanese also occupied all the high ground, so the men of the 32nd Division lived and fought and died in the swamps on the north coast of the Papuan Peninsula. Initially, the battle went poorly for the compromised men of the 32nd Infantry Division, and General MacArthur, very early on in the battle, would relieve General Edwin Forrest Harding, the beloved general of the 32nd Division, and the man who had literally wrote the manual on modern infantry tactics, of his duties. He accused General Harding of cowardice and accused the whole 32nd Division of cowardice, and replaced General Harding with General Robert Eichelberger. And before General Robert Eichelberger left Port Moresby, MacArthur told him, "Take Buna or don't come back alive." Eventually, with reinforcements from the 41st Division and with the arrival of what they didn't have early on, bazookas and tanks and 105 millimeter howitzers, the 32nd Division did take Buna on January 22nd of 1943 in what the Army calls the first land victory of the South Pacific. But it was a land victory that came at a high cost. Casualties pushed 80%. Companies in the 2nd Ghost Mountain Battalion ceased to exist. Even General MacArthur was alarmed by the casualty rate. After Buna, he promised himself he never again would fight a land battle of what he called the bloody grinding type. And he resolved then to use what he called his leapfrog strategy, to use his 5th Air Force and his amphibious forces to cut the Japanese supply line off, to cut off their food, to cut off their reinforcements, and to cut off their medicine, and to let them, as he later said, rot on the vine. General Eichelberger would later write in his biography, Our Jungle Road to Tokyo, Buna was bought at a substantial price in death, wounds, disease, despair, and human suffering. Fatalities closely approached, percentage-wise, the heaviest losses in our own Civil War battles. No one who fought there, however hard he tries, will ever forget it. General Eichelberger would later write in his biography, Our Jungle Road to Tokyo, Buna was bought at a substantial price in death, wounds, disease, despair, and human suffering. Fatalities closely approached, percentage-wise, the heaviest losses in our own Civil War battles. No one who fought there, however hard he tries, will ever forget it. Well, I thank you very much for attending, and thank you all for listening. What I'd like to do now, before fielding your questions, is I'd like to show you an 8-minute video. In 2006, I assembled a small expedition team, and we flew to New Guinea, and we retraced for the first time since 1942 the Ghost Mountain Boys trek through the swamps and jungles and over the peaks of the Owen Stanley Mountains. It again is 8 minutes long. I'd like you to watch it. I hope you enjoy it. And after that, I'll gladly take your questions. Again, thank you.
Weka Buna beka na la juedwani ka na la juedwa Sidika Buna be gubano la juedwe gubano la juedwe gubano la juedwe juedwa merorani juedwa merorani In
a journey that strained the limits of endurance, James Campbell has rediscovered a nearly forgotten chapter of World War II bravery and suffering. In 2006, The author and adventurer began an extraordinary quest to retrace the path of an American infantry battalion sent on an impossible mission. The soldiers were ordered to march 120 miles over the uncharted mountains of New Guinea. Their journey has been described as one of the cruelest in modern military history. Many of them National Guardsmen from the Midwest, they would endure an incredible test of survival before they even entered combat. Starting from their coastal camp, the soldiers slashed their way through the jungle to a 9,000-foot peak that the natives said was haunted. The soldiers called it Ghost Mountain, and they would become known as the Ghost Mountain Boys.
Well, Ghost Mountain, we walked over to Ghost Mountain.
There wasn't a bug, a fly, or nothing. There was no birds. It was just weird. It was eerie.
As we went along, and of course, the more burdensome you got, the tired you got, well, you start shedding stuff. And I think when we went over to Ghost Mountain is when I shed everything I had.
And those natives would go over it because I think they had, they couldn't go but just so far.
Malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, trench foots, and hunger plagued them. And on the other side of the mountains, elite troops of the Japanese Empire waited in their bunkers. The battles on the beaches and in the swamps of New Guinea, sometimes fought hand to hand, were some of the most savage of the South Pacific War. That was 1942. More than a half-century later, Campbell began assembling his Ghost Mountain team.
Ghost Mountain.
Old friend and Chicago-based journalist George Hood agreed to take part, suggesting they collaborate on a documentary. Another friend, Dave Musgrave, a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and an accomplished backpacker, also signed on.
I can't imagine doing this. Not knowing what's ahead, having dysentery, malaria, not having the right equipment.
Outside magazine photographer Philip Engelhorn became the team's fourth member.
Can I go home now?
German by birth, Engelhorn was based in Hong Kong.
I'm tired and I'm hungry.
Palm Productions of New Guinea provided a camera crew. The trail boss was Lee Ticehurst, an Australian living in New Guinea and an experienced jungle trekker.
Slingshots and spears and the dogs. The dogs are more important than anything else that you can hunt with. These dogs will not bark until they see the game. And then everybody knows it's on.
On a hot June day, from a high ridge overlooking the Mimani River, Campbell and his team began their journey. That first day, the expedition nearly collapsed when Campbell fell and re-injured a knee. He was forced to turn back. Tired and dehydrated, Hood also retreated.
We're feeling pretty exhausted. It's a tortuous country. I'm 44 years old with a bad wheel. Thought I could do it, and it's a killer. We get 3 days in, we start failing, then what the heck do we do? Plus, we didn't want to slow down the entire group. Rather humiliating, as you might imagine.
The rest of the team went on. Back in Port Moresby, Campbell and Hood regrouped. 4 days later, they rejoined the team by helicopter, landing at a village called La Rooney. The team did not travel alone. As the American Army had done, the team hired carriers and guides from the villages along the route. Among them was Beirua. As a 7-year-old boy, too frightened to stay behind, Beirua followed his parents as they carried ammunition and supplies for the Americans. Now more than 70, he and his wife Buna would help guide Campbell and his team over Ghost Mountain. Barua warned Campbell the mountain was haunted by Masalai, evil spirits and demons. Barua told other stories and helped the team find those who knew or remembered the American soldiers.
Oh, Jesus help me. Jesus help me.
They saw that plane crash, and then the troops were moving. The American troops will start moving down to where the plane crashed.
Those tales have become part of the local folklore, passed down from generation to generation around village campfires. In 1942, the rugged interior of New Guinea was an unmapped wilderness. 64 years later, the team would discover an ecosystem and native people largely unchanged by the passage of time. New Guinea remains a land of no roads and long-forgotten villages, where hunters still use slingshots and spears and have little contact with the outside world. After more than a month of suffering, the men of the Ghost Mountain Battalion reached the north coast of New Guinea. They went directly into battle, joined by the rest of their 32nd Infantry Division comrades. According to one historian, the combat was a knife fight out of the Stone Age. Though not on a military mission, Campbell's team pushed across New Guinea toward an important goal: to resurrect the story of the Ghost Mountain Boys. It became an ordeal the team could not have imagined, and one it will never forget.